You're listening to Non-Toxic. I'm Daniel Penny. Sperm counts around the developed world are declining, with some studies showing they've dropped by nearly half since the 1970s. While commentators search for the culprit, it could be obesity or nutritional deficiencies. Even feminism has been blamed. Birth rates are still falling, and in some places they've crashed below replacement levels. Vice President J.D. Vance has called the problem, quote, a civilizational crisis. Much like Colonel Jack Ripper in Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, the manosphere has become obsessed with our manly juices.
The international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
Just Keep Swimming is a new mini-series that I'm doing, looking at the rising rates of male infertility and its relationship to real and imagined impurities in our environment. In the first episode, you heard a conversation I had with Felix van der Heijden, a Dutch looksmaxer who intentionally allowed his fertility to drop while he was using testosterone and other performance-enhancing drugs. But the reality is that while these drugs are becoming more popular, they're not widespread. The society-ending fertility drops reported by The Guardian, BBC, and elsewhere are more likely to be the result of environmental factors. And the most likely culprit is a class of molecules called endocrine-disrupting chemicals, or EDCs, which are ingredients in thousands of products that we use every day. They coat our food packaging and receipts, make plastic water bottles harder and IV bags softer, help fragrances and makeup last longer, and prevent stains on our couches and clothes. They're basically in everything, and a growing body of research suggests that their cumulative effects are wreaking havoc on our reproductive systems, especially for men.
A large majority of people think that consumer product chemicals have to be tested before they're put into use. So people are making the assumption that whatever's on the shelf has been evaluated for safety, and that's just not true.
In this episode of Just Keep Swimming, I'm sitting down with Dr. Julia Brody, Senior Scientist and Executive Director of Silent Spring Institute, along with Research Director Ruth Ann Rudell. In case you don't know what the Silent Spring Institute is, it's an independent scientific research organization dedicated to uncovering the links between chemicals in our environment and women's health, with a focus on breast cancer prevention. The name is a tribute to Rachel Carson, one of my all-time favorite authors, who released a famous 1962 book on pesticides and other chemicals called Silent Spring, which basically launched the modern environmental movement. And I actually talk about her quite a bit with Amy in the miniseries Carbon Bros. Listen to episode 3 if you want to learn more. Lately, the Silent Spring Institute has been expanding their research to focus on other chemicals of concern, including endocrine disruptors. In this episode, we discuss how EDC exposure harms fertility and its worrisome effects on future generations, the differences between fast metabolizing EDCs and forever chemicals, and how policy tools can drive real reductions in our exposure to this stuff. So, whether you're sperm maxing and trying to have a kid, or you just care about your health, the episode, I think, is a really useful one because it closes with some practical advice anyone can act on today. I suggest you stick around if you want to learn how to reduce your own exposure to endocrine-disrupting chemicals. Welcome to Non-Toxic. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here today. I thought it might be useful to define some terms. Endocrine disrupting chemicals, sometimes referred to as EDCs. What are EDCs? How do they work in the human body?
Endocrine disruptors are chemicals that act by disrupting normal hormone signaling and processes. So body uses hormones to communicate from one organ to another, or from one part of an organ to another, about whether it's time to grow or or make this protein. What was novel about endocrine disruptors, there became a lot more awareness about them, is that the traditional ways we were testing chemicals to see if there was toxicity was not suited to detect effects of chemicals that interfered with hormone systems. And so that's what made them special.
So let's talk about the male reproductive system then, since that is the focus of this conversation. What do EDCs do to the male reproductive system, and how men are not dipping their penises in these chemicals? So how is it that they're being affected by them?
For context, endocrine disruptors can act in many ways. Some of them affect testosterone signaling. Some of them affect progesterone or estrogen signaling. Some of them affect thyroid hormones. A good example is phthalates. Phthalates are what makes a lot of plastics flexible. They are in food contact materials, medical material like IV bags, any kind of vinyl and plastic toys, like floor coverings. They're everywhere, basically, that there's soft plastics. They're at pretty high concentrations and they come out. So dietary exposure is important for some phthalates because of the use in food. We did a study actually with breast cancer prevention partners to figure out where phthalates were coming from. We enrolled 5 families, 4 people in each family, and we collected their urine every night for a week. In the middle of that week, we gave them catered food that was all made from fresh ingredients that have contact with plastic, wasn't stored in plastic, and gave them instructions about water bottles, coffee, no restaurants, all of that kind of thing. Lowered their exposures to bisphenol A by 2/3, lowered their exposures to one of the phthalates, DEH, by about half in a 3-day intervention.
That's a really fast effect.
Yeah, because they're rapidly metabolized and cleared, basically. But the exposure is ongoing, so you always have some in you.
Okay, so these endocrine disrupting chemicals, they're in consumer products. We're exposed to them all different ways. Some of them we metabolize quickly, others stay in our body forever. A lot of them affect testosterone and estrogen in various ways. So why is it that our fertility is so susceptible to disruption when it comes to EDCs?
The endocrine system does 2 different things in the organism: communicating and keeping things in homeostasis, signaling it's time to prepare for possible fertilization in a baby. But the most important and the more vulnerable to disruption is during development, during pregnancy, also early in life, like you're still developing in that time. The hormone signal is programming the tissue to develop in a certain way. And if you misprogram it, you can get like a feminized phenotype, you could get undescended testes.
You mentioned earlier that phthalates are fast metabolizing. So does that mean that effects of phthalate exposure are reversible? Like, are there fixes with some of these chemicals? Which are the ones where you can make an intervention in your life, and which are the ones where you're stuck with whatever you've got?
I think with any chemical exposures, you can make an intervention and it will be helpful. Some of them you can see the effects in the short term, some of them will be in the long term. It's about reversible and irreversible effects depending on when the exposure occurs in development and what pathway it's affecting, in what stage of development that organism is at.
Are there any treatments doctors are developing for these exposures, or is it just stop being exposed to the chemical and you will experience some improvement?
Well, some of the effects can be medically treated, like hypospadias or cryptorchidism, or even low fertility. Medical interventions can help dads who are having fertility issues, but that's not the same as reversing the effect.
So there are things that you can do, but they're not. For example, if you are exposed to EDCs in the womb and you have smaller anal genital distance and lower sperm count and lower testosterone production, you could do testosterone replacement therapy, maybe, but that's certainly not going to improve your sperm count. You could do various kind of lifestyle changes to try to boost your sperm count, such as it is, but there are fundamental thresholds that biologically you're not going to be able to change, I suppose.
Yeah, we can't change the structure and developmental effects.
You released a paper, or the Silent Spring Institute released a paper measuring the public's understanding or lack thereof when it comes to the dangers of endocrine disrupting chemicals. Can you talk a little bit about what you found?
Well, it was a two-phase study. First, we convened a group of experts who were studying endocrine disruptors to ask them what people needed to know of endocrine disruptors in order to make good decisions for themselves personally, but also as members of communities and voters. Then we used that information to create a survey that we fielded nationally to see how people's understanding compared with what the experts thought they should know. I was surprised at the strength of people's understanding of some of the basics, that people had a good understanding, for example, that exposures to a mother during pregnancy could affect the fetus. So that's good. There is a foundation out there. But there were some major misconceptions, one of them being that a large majority of people think that consumer product chemicals have to be tested before they're put into use. So people are making the assumption that whatever's on the shelf has been evaluated for safety, and that's just not true. The other major misconception is, and this is particular to cancer, but people think that most cancers are due to inherited genes, which is actually not true. But that's the kind of misconception that would lead you to not care about your own personal exposures. So those were just a couple of findings that I thought were really important for us to address so that people understand that you really can make a significant difference in your own exposures through your individual choices, but also through your participation in your community.
That's actually a great segue into my next question, which has to do with the limits of personal intervention versus government or societal response. The Trump administration has rolled back a lot of chemical regulations and environmental regulations, but there are also some states that are trying to fill that void. Today, New York State just announced a lawsuit against DuPont and 3M and some other companies over their use of PFAS in consumer products. How do you think the US government is handling the problem of chemical exposure, especially endocrine disrupting chemicals, compared to previous administrations, but also like other governments, either state or around the world? Because I think there's a huge variation depending on who's in charge.
Yeah, I'm going to pick that up with the positive example. You mentioned the importance of state level action, and we did see in our research a convergence of science, public, and government response for flame retardants. We tested flame retardants in air and dust in homes, first in Massachusetts and then in California. And when we saw really high levels in California, because of that state's particular flammability standard, did get activated and that standard was changed. And that actually resulted in the availability of foam furniture nationwide that doesn't include chemical flame retardants, and it meets fire safety standards without them. So it was a good news story of the convergence of science and action at the state level.
I want to add to that because we've done a fairly extensive analysis with collaborators in California of California's Proposition 65 law to see how it's been effective at reducing exposures, including to phthalates and other chemicals across the U.S. And many people like to, in industry as representatives especially, may ridicule all the warnings, like this is known by the state of California to cause cancer or reproductive harm. But what we found is that when things are listed, exposures go down in the US. And we also interviewed industry representatives and their consultants to find that they quietly replace those listed chemicals with others in the products. They don't advertise it, but they want to avoid having to put warnings on their products. And the chemicals listed on that list sort of take on a life in other regulations in other states, other countries. So it's actually a very impactful law, even though it's not regulatory at all, just about consumer advising.
So it's not even banning the use of these chemicals. It's just requiring some kind of signage or language warning people about it.
Yeah.
You mentioned concern about what's happening at the federal level. And I think an example of that is the drinking water standards for PFAS. PFAS has been associated with a wide range of health effects.
I think including testicular. The effects on communities is that what's happened essentially is that the public health community is taken by surprise that so many water supplies across the country have been contaminated with PFAS. The things that are described sometimes as a new threat, they're not a new threat to everybody. When communities don't have a drinking water standard, they don't have a way to know what is the amount they need to treat to, like what is a safe level. That's what the drinking water standard has to say. And your water supplier isn't going to think about it for themselves and make up their own number. They need that standard to comply with. And then they need those chemicals to be listed as hazardous materials so that they can use the Superfund law or the tort law to sue the people who polluted so that they can recover the costs, the very expensive costs of treating those water supplies.
In the case of PFAS, right, it's very difficult to, once that is in the environment or in the water supply or in our bodies, it's very difficult to get out. It's a whole different level of filtration and treatment than what normally happens.
Yeah, exactly. And to remove PFAS, you need to add a very expensive granular activated carbon treatment. And so what's happened to the communities is that where this pollution occurred, and there are many, many of them across the U.S., is that first, the people were poisoned essentially by their drinking water to some greater or lesser degrees, and which we're studying to see what those effects were. And they have to pay higher rates in order to treat to get it out. Yeah. Fair.
That's adding insult to injury. This is always a question people ask me. What can I do? People are freaked out, especially when they understand the full ramifications of what some of this chemical exposure means. A lot of my friends are at the age where they're having children or they're contemplating having children, and either they're running into problems with their fertility or they're concerned about exposure in utero and early development. And they're concerned about their own long-term health. So if you had to pick 3 effective, large impact changes that someone could make in their lives, that doesn't involve moving into the woods in New Hampshire and becoming a homesteader or something like that.
I'm going to give my top 3. Very easy. Go fragrance-free. That's a very easy one, and read the labels for various ones of these chemicals. But I'm counting that as 1. Number 2 is going to be ventilate and vacuum and wet mop. Keep your dust levels low in your house. And number 3 is vote in every election.
That's a good. Why are those effective interventions, going fragrance-free and frequent vacuuming and mopping? I think I understand the voting one.
Okay. Well, fragrance is a mixture of lots of different chemicals, many of which are endocrine disruptors. And in addition to the fragrance chemicals, there are phthalates, which are carriers of fragrance associated with them. And just because it's very easy to pick fragrance.
So we're talking like a laundry detergent
one reason I like
or
it.
Dishwashing detergent, things like that.
Yes. Yeah. Forget the air freshener. And And the ventilate and vacuum, that's like to keep dust levels low. People may not realize that these pollutants are building up inside their house in air and dust. So ventilating will give you new air, and vacuuming with a HEPA filter, high efficiency filter, or wet wiping surfaces will lower your dust levels.
Those are good. And I'll add that just be aware that anything you buy at the store, it's made up of chemicals. And if there's a lot of plastic, it's all coming from fossil fuels. I was going to talk about exhaust emissions from fossil fuels, basically, and combustion products as an important place to try to reduce exposure as well. And then plastics contain a lot of other hazardous chemicals in them to make them heat resistant or color or flexibility or firmness. They're also like big polyurethane foam, engineer wood. There's a lot of glue. The glue is off-gassing. So just be aware. It is a buyer beware kind of situation right now because the things are not tested before they get on the shelves. We also have a smartphone app called Detox Me that gives top 10 suggestions for home, child, food, cleaning. There's a couple other categories and gives tips that helps guide people for making reductions. The thing it doesn't do is tell you what to buy. The reason for that is it's hard to know what's in the products for sure, and formulations change all the time. And we also really just want to be not in a situation where we have conflict of interest and someone's paying us to promote their product. So we don't give that information, but we help people figure out how to make better choices. And we're updating the app in the next month or two and doing a new release. It's going to have a lot more new functions. I think be very helpful to like help people reduce their exposure.
Should people get tested? Like if they're worried, is that worth doing, or is that the sort of thing that just makes you crazier?
It's very hard to get tested for a lot of these chemicals. There aren't routine tests available. But one thing I do want to add is that studies are testing people. One of the things I've been involved in is telling people what their results are. People imagine that people will freak out about this information, but they actually don't. People can accommodate this kind of information. They appreciate getting their results, and most people do make at least some changes after
Amazing.
they see them.
Yeah, actually, we did a study a while ago. We crowdsourced it, opened it up to the public. They could send in urine samples, and we analyzed for some phthalates and phenolic, some other kind of common endocrine disruptors, and also asked people some questions about their behaviors, what they were buying and avoiding. And what we found was that people who are avoiding some chemicals that are well labeled on the package had lower levels of those. But people who are trying to avoid something like bisphenol A, it's not really labeled at all. No relationship between trying to avoid it and having lower levels. So disclosure and labeling are, right to know, really very important issues, having some transparency around what's in it.
Thank you both so much for making some time this afternoon to come on Non-Toxic and talk about endocrine disruptors and your work at Silent Spring. So if people want to follow your work, or if they want to download the app Detox Me, how do they go about that?
Detox Me, they can get in both the Apple Store and Google. So whatever kind of phone you have, you can just go to your app store and get it. And it would be great to have people follow silentspring.org. We're on Facebook and Instagram, and so that would be lovely to be in touch with everyone.
And that's it for this episode of Non-Toxic and the mini-series Just Keep Swimming. On the next episode of this little mini-series I'm doing, I'll be talking with a representative from Oikotex, a textile testing group that certifies that the clothes we wear and the furnishings in our homes are actually safe. And one of the biggest areas that they have been looking into in recent years are EDCs. So if you're curious about how chemical pollution winds up not only in our food, but on the stuff we wear, you're going to be interested, I think, in that episode.
The skin itself really is one of the largest organs that we have. So people do have an introduction to those chemicals through just normal use, right? I'm wearing it all day long. So I'm getting lots and lots of hours of exposure of the same thing.
As always, the music for Non-Toxic is by Nathan Sharp, and the artwork is by Sam Creasy. Non-Toxic is only possible because of listeners like you. So if you'd like to support the show, head on over to substack.com/nontoxicpodcast/subscribe and become a paying subscriber today. I think this episode and the ones that I'll be putting out are providing a lot of really good resources, and it takes a lot of reading and vetting of experts to make something valuable like this. So I hope that you appreciate it. And if you do, maybe throw me a couple bucks. All right. Thanks for listening. And I'll see you next week with another episode of this mini series, Just Keep Swimming from Non-Toxic.